The courthouse stood like an old guardian at the center of the small American town. Its brick walls, faded by years of sun and rain, carried the weight of countless stories, some forgotten, some still whispered about in diners and corner stores. But never before had the townspeople seen a case like this. On that brisk autumn morning, the courthouse buzzed with attention. It was almost alive inside. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and paper, a mixture of history and authority. Reporters shuffled into the back rows, balancing notebooks and cameras, whispering about the unusual witness expected to take the stand. Mothers clutched their children's hands, fathers folded arms tightly across their chests, and elderly neighbors leaned forward, determined not to miss a single detail. At the heart of it all was a 3-year-old girl, too young to tie her shoes without help, yet old enough to hold the truth that could decide the fate of a man accused of an unthinkable act. She was the kind of child who should have been at home stacking blocks, coloring with crayons, or learning nursery rhymes, but instead, she was about to step into the most intimidating room in town. The judge entered, robes flowing, and the room stood in respect. He was a man known for his no-nonsense demeanor, his sharp gavel strikes, and his refusal to tolerate delays. Yet even he looked uneasy. His gray eyes softened for a moment as he scanned the room, aware of how extraordinary the day would be. He knew the law, but he also knew children, and he understood the fragile nature of their trust. The prosecutor, a woman in her early 40s with neatly tied hair and a determined expression, stacked her files carefully. She had spent sleepless nights preparing for this moment, rehearsing the simplest of questions, revising them again and again to ensure they wouldn't overwhelm the child. She knew every word mattered. Her case depended on the smallest voice in the room. Across from her sat the defense attorney, a man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a smooth voice that carried both charm and calculation. He leaned back in his chair, pen twirling lazily between his fingers. His strategy was clear. If the child remained silent or appeared confused, doubt would creep into the jury's minds. And doubt, he knew, was his strongest ally. The jury filed in, 12 strangers bound by duty, each face a mask of seriousness. Some were parents, some grandparents, and a few young enough to remember their own childhood fears. They had been told not to let emotion guide them, but already, the thought of a toddler taking the stand pulled at something deep inside. The courtroom's large clock ticked loudly, each second echoing like a drumbeat of anticipation. The prosecutor glanced at the doors, where the girl would soon appear. She tightened her grip on her pen, steadying herself. She had handled difficult witnesses before, but never one so young, so vulnerable. When the bailiff finally announced the arrival of the child, the room fell into silence. The sound of tiny footsteps echoed faintly in the hallway, then grew louder. The doors creaked open, and there she was dressed in a pale yellow dress with a bow slightly crooked at the back, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit that looked like it had been loved through countless nights of fear and comfort. Her mother walked beside her, guiding her gently toward the witness stand. The little girl's eyes darted nervously across the sea of unfamiliar faces. She clutched her toy tighter, as though it were a shield. The room, filled with seasoned adults, seemed enormous and unfriendly to her small frame. The judge's stern expression softened further as he watched her climb, awkwardly, into the oversized chair. He gave a small nod to the bailiff, who adjusted the microphone down to her level. But when the time came for her to speak, her lips pressed together tightly, her chin trembling. She looked down at her stuffed rabbit, as if asking it for help. The prosecutor approached slowly, kneeling slightly so she wouldn't tower over the child. She spoke gently, her voice stripped of the usual sharpness that came with cross-examination. "Sweetheart," she began softly, "do you know why you're here today?" The girl's fingers twisted into the rabbit's ears. Her wide eyes lifted, but no words came out. A hush settled across the courtroom, so heavy it almost rang in people's ears. The defense attorney leaned back further, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. To him, the silence was victory. A child who couldn't speak was a child whose testimony would collapse under its own weight. The prosecutor tried again, this time asking about the girl's favorite color. Nothing, not a word. The girl lowered her head, tears threatening to spill, her tiny shoulders shaking. Murmurs rose from the crowd, soft gasps of sympathy, but also doubt. Some wondered aloud if this had been too much to expect of someone so young. The judge cleared his throat, shifting in his chair. He was about to intervene when the prosecutor glanced at the bailiff, then back at the judge. Her eyes held a silent request. The judge hesitated, then gave a slow nod. Moments later, the courtroom doors opened again, and in walked a golden retriever with calm, steady steps. The dog's vest read, "Court Support Dog," its blue fabric standing out against the polished wood of the floor. The child's head snapped up instantly, her eyes brightening. She leaned forward eagerly as the dog padded closer, tail wagging gently, and settled beside the witness stand. Without hesitation, she let go of her stuffed rabbit and reached for the dog, burying her tiny hands in its fur. For the first time that day, she smiled. The prosecutor's heart lifted. The defense attorney's smirk faltered, and the entire courtroom seemed to lean forward, as if sensing that something remarkable was about to happen. For weeks, the town had debated whether a child could really bear witness. But in that single moment, with her hand resting on the dog's back and her face softened with trust, the question was no longer whether she could, but how her truth would finally find its way into the light. The judge tapped his gavel gently, not to call order, but almost as a signal that a new chapter in justice had begun. The trial was no longer just about evidence and arguments. It was about courage, compassion, and the unlikeliest bond between a child and a dog. And as the clock ticked past the first hour of testimony, everyone in the room knew they were witnessing something that would be told and retold for years, because this was no ordinary case. This was the case that shook a small town, and it was only just beginning. The atmosphere in the courtroom thickened like a storm cloud just before breaking. Every person present knew the weight of the moment about to unfold. This was no ordinary trial. It wasn't about hardened criminals or seasoned witnesses. Instead, the burden of truth rested on shoulders far too small to carry it. The bailiff's voice rang out as he opened the heavy wooden door. "Bring in the witness." What entered the room wasn't what the jury expected. Tiny footsteps echoed on the marble floor, hesitant, careful, almost afraid. A 3-year-old girl appeared, clutching her mother's hand with one fist and a frayed stuffed rabbit with the other. Her yellow dress, ironed neatly, swayed as she shuffled forward. She looked both delicate and determined, though her wide eyes revealed the fear only a child could feel when surrounded by strangers staring. Silently, every whisper in the gallery stopped. The prosecutor, standing near her table, caught her breath. She had prepared for this moment for weeks, rehearsing how to phrase questions, how to speak slowly and gently, how to help a toddler find words. But no amount of preparation could erase the weight of watching that little girl take her first trembling steps into the center of the courtroom. The defense attorney adjusted his glasses and leaned back casually, but inside he was calculating. He knew children were unpredictable. Silence could work in his favor. Confusion could create doubt. And in the world of law, doubt was the sharpest weapon. The girl's mother guided her to the witness stand. The chair, designed for adults, loomed too large. The bailiff quickly fetched a booster cushion, sliding it beneath her so she could sit upright. The little girl clambered onto the seat awkwardly, her rabbit never leaving her grasp. She sat there, blinking at the crowd. Her small shoes dangled far above the polished floor, swinging nervously. The microphone, lowered to her level, looked enormous in front of her. For a moment, she pressed her lips together and buried her face into the stuffed rabbit's worn fur. The judge leaned forward slightly, softening his stern features. He understood this was no ordinary testimony. He cleared his throat gently. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice unusually warm, "do you know why you're here today?" The little girl's eyes flicked toward him. She opened her mouth as though to answer, but froze. Instead, she looked at her mother, then back at the rabbit. Silence filled the air like a heavy blanket. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Some leaned forward, trying to catch even the faintest whisper, while others sat back, recognizing the immense challenge before the child. The prosecutor's chest tightened. This was the moment she had feared. The courtroom, with its hard edges and cold formality, was no place for a toddler. Taking a careful step closer, the prosecutor crouched slightly so she wouldn't tower over the witness. She smiled gently. "Can you tell me your name?" The girl's small fingers twisted into the rabbit's ears. Her lips trembled, but no sound came out. "It's okay," the prosecutor added softly. "You don't have to be afraid. You can just tell us what you want." Still nothing. The girl's wide eyes darted across the room, locking on the jury, the lawyers, the reporters scribbling in the back. It was too much. Her tiny body shivered as though the weight of the world had landed on her shoulders. The defense attorney leaned toward his table, scribbling a note for effect, his lips twitching with the hint of a smile. This silence, this fragile hesitation, was working in his favor. If she couldn't speak, the jury might never hear her side. The prosecutor, unwilling to give up, tried a different approach. "What's your favorite color?" she asked warmly. The question was simple, harmless, even playful. But again, no answer came. The little girl pulled the rabbit close to her face, hiding. A murmur rippled through the gallery. People exchanged glances, some frowning with sympathy, others sighing in disappointment. A few skeptics wondered if perhaps this was a mistake, that maybe such a young child should never have been brought into the courtroom at all. The judge tapped his gavel gently, restoring silence. His eyes lingered on the child, then on the prosecutor. He was torn between the law and compassion. This was uncharted territory, and the outcome seemed fragile. Just as despair began to settle over the room, a faint sound broke the silence. It was almost imperceptible, at first a soft hum. The girl was whispering, but not to the adults. Her head bent low toward her stuffed rabbit, her lips moving gently against its worn fur. The prosecutor tilted her head, straining to listen. "Sweetheart, are you talking to your bunny?" she asked. The little girl nodded, still whispering. No one could hear her words, but it was clear she was speaking, just not to the humans towering around her. Gasps and curious murmurs filled the courtroom again. The judge raised a brow. The defense attorney frowned, realizing the silence had cracked. The prosecutor's mind raced. If she couldn't talk to adults, maybe she could talk through something else, someone else. The bailiff, standing at the side, exchanged a knowing glance with the prosecutor. Quietly, almost discreetly, he slipped out of the courtroom. Moments later, he returned with the answer that would change the trial, the golden retriever in his blue vest. The comfort dog trained for moments just like this. But that moment belonged to part 3. For now, the courtroom remained balanced on the edge of uncertainty. The jury waited, the judge watched closely, and the child clutched her rabbit as if it were her lifeline. Everyone knew something extraordinary was about to happen, but no one could have predicted how a 3-year-old girl, too frightened to speak, would soon turn the entire trial upside down. The silence in the courtroom had turned suffocating. Each second stretched longer than it should, amplifying the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. The 3-year-old girl sat frozen on the witness stand, Her tiny hands clamped around the ears of her stuffed rabbit. Her lips trembled, but no words came out. The jury shifted restlessly, glancing at one another with unspoken concern. The prosecutor, still crouched near the stand, fought to steady her breathing. She had prepared for hesitation, but this absolute wall of silence threatened to dismantle the entire case. The defense attorney leaned back in his chair, pen tapping lightly against his notepad, his expression betraying smug satisfaction. Every second the girl remained silent was another seed of doubt planted in the minds of the jury. And doubt, he knew, could be enough to unravel the prosecution's case. Then, in the middle of that suffocating pause, the door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Heads turned. A ripple of curiosity spread across the gallery as the bailiff stepped inside, and beside him padded a golden retriever. The dog's golden coat gleamed under the courtroom lights, and his calm demeanor seemed almost otherworldly in the tension of that moment. His vest bore the words "Court Support Dog" embroidered in bold letters. A collective murmur rose, echoing like a soft wave. Some jurors straightened in their seats. A few spectators gasped quietly. Even the judge arched his brows, though he quickly masked it with the neutrality his role demanded. The little girl's eyes widened instantly. Her lips parted, and for the first time since she had entered the courtroom, her face lit up not with fear, but with recognition. She tugged at her stuffed rabbit, as if silently introducing her old companion to this new one. The dog walked steadily toward the front of the courtroom, tail swaying gently, his steps unhurried. He exuded calm, a stark contrast to the rigid tension around him. The bailiff led him to the witness stand and gave a small nod. The retriever lowered himself onto the floor beside the child, lying down with his head raised, eyes soft, and body perfectly still. The little girl reached out immediately, her tiny fingers sinking into the dog's fur. A quiet sigh escaped her lips. It was a sound of relief so pure it silenced even the defense attorney's smirk. She leaned forward, resting her cheek briefly against the dog's back, as though she had found the safest place in the entire world. The atmosphere shifted in an instant. The courtroom, once heavy with skepticism, softened. The jurors, who had been skeptical of the child's silence, now leaned forward with renewed interest. The gallery's murmurs faded into stillness, replaced by the quiet, unspoken understanding that something extraordinary was unfolding before their eyes. The prosecutor's heart surged with hope. She knew the retriever had been trained for this train, to provide comfort, to offer silent reassurance to those too afraid to find their voice. But watching it happen, watching the girl transform in real time, was something entirely different. The judge cleared his throat, his tone softer than before. "Counsel, proceed." The prosecutor nodded and turned back to the girl. She kept her voice calm, almost conversational. "Sweetheart, do you like dogs?" The girl's fingers twisted into the retriever's fur. Her lips moved. At first, it seemed she was still whispering into silence, but this time, the whisper was directed toward the dog. The court fell utterly still, straining to hear. The handler, standing close by, leaned in. Then, with a gentle voice, he repeated for the record. She said yes. Gasps echoed softly around the room. For the first time, the little girl had spoken not to the adults towering over her, but to the silent guardian by her side. The prosecutor felt a rush of relief. "What's his name?" she asked Dot again. The child bent close, her lips brushing the retriever's ear. The handler smiled faintly and said, "She's asking him if he wants to tell." A ripple of laughter spread gently through the room, breaking the tension. Even the judge's stern face softened into something resembling a smile. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence cracking. He scribbled something on his notepad, though it was clear his advantage had begun to slip away. The little girl continued stroking the retriever, her shoulders relaxing. For the first time, She looked less like a child, trapped in a room too big for her, and more like someone who belonged there, protected, grounded, and ready. The prosecutor leaned closer, careful not to rush. "Can you tell your dog what happened?" The girl's tiny voice whispered again, words lost in the retriever's fur. The handler translated softly. Piece by piece, the child began to share her story. It was halting at first, simple words, short phrases. But each time she spoke to the dog, her confidence grew. She wasn't answering adults. She wasn't staring into the faces of strangers. She was talking to her silent guardian, the only one in the room who asked for nothing in return. The jury leaned in, hanging on every word the handler relayed. Their expressions shifted from skepticism to empathy, then to quiet resolve. They weren't just hearing evidence, they were witnessing courage, fragile but undeniable, loom right in front of them. The judge folded his hands, his gaze lingering on the girl and the dog. He had presided over countless trials, witnessed hardened criminals, tearful testimonies, fiery debates. But this simple act of a child whispering to a dog was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was raw, honest, and profoundly human. The defense attorney, realizing the tide was turning, rose to object. "Your Honor," he began, this is highly irregular. A dog cannot serve as a legal interpreter." The judge silenced him with a firm look. "Sit down, counselor. The court will allow it." And just like that, the unshakable silence of a child had been broken not by pressure, not by force, but by the presence of a golden retriever who asked for nothing more than to sit quietly and listen. From that moment forward, the courtroom was no longer the same. The child, who had entered trembling and voiceless, now had a bridge to truth. The dog had transformed the trial, not with words, but with presence, patience, and a kind of love that transcended rules. Everyone in the room knew they were witnessing history. And as the golden retriever settled more comfortably at the child's feet, his job only just beginning, the story of this trial became something larger than justice. It became a lesson in compassion. The golden retriever sat patiently at the little girl's side, a silent guardian with eyes full of calm understanding. The air in the courtroom was different now, lighter, though still charged with anticipation. Every face turned toward the witness stand, waiting to see if the child, who had moments earlier seemed frozen in silence, might finally let her voice be heard. The prosecutor crouched a few steps away, careful not to intrude on the fragile moment unfolding. She had seen witnesses break down under pressure, adults crumble under the weight of questioning, but never had she seen such transformation in a child. One moment trembling and mute, the next whispering into the ear of a dog, as if he were her most trusted friend. "Sweetheart," the prosecutor said softly, her voice as gentle as a lullaby, "you can tell your dog anything. He's here to listen." The girl glanced at her stuffed rabbit, then back to the golden retriever. Slowly, she leaned down, her lips brushing against the dog's velvety ear. No one could hear the words. She spoke in the hushed, secretive tone of a child, confiding in a bedtime friend. The handler, standing discreetly beside them, tilted his head, listening closely. After a pause, he lifted his gaze toward the judge. She said, "He makes her feel safe." A hush fell over the room. Jurors exchanged glances, some with softened expressions, others blinking back tears they would never admit to shedding in a courtroom. The judge shifted in his seat, his normally stern features betraying the faintest flicker of emotion. The defense attorney opened his mouth, as if to object, but closed it again. He knew this wasn't just testimony. It was something deeper, something the jury would never forget. Encouraged, the prosecutor leaned closer. "That's wonderful. Do you want to tell your dog about what happened that day?" The little girl's fingers twisted in the retriever's fur. She hesitated, eyes darting toward the rows of adults, watching her every move. Then she buried her face in the dog's ear, Once again, the handler's voice broke the silence. She says she saw the man. A ripple of energy moved through the courtroom. The jurors sat straighter, pens poised above notepads. Reporters scribbled furiously. The prosecutor's heart leapt, though she forced herself to remain calm, steady, gentle. "Can you tell your dog what the man did?" she asked softly. The child hesitated, her small shoulders trembling. The retriever, sensing her fear, shifted closer, pressing his body against her legs. She exhaled shakily, her tiny voice whispering again, so quiet only the dog could hear. The handler's voice came, steady and clear. "She says the man scared her." The gallery stirred with emotion, a mixture of outrage and sorrow. The judge raised a hand for silence, though his eyes never left the girl. The prosecutor swallowed hard. "You're doing so well, sweetheart," she said gently. "You're very brave. Can you tell your dog what the man looked like?" The child nodded, clutching the retriever's fur tightly. She whispered into his ear, pausing as though choosing her words carefully. She says, "He had dark eyes," the handler relayed, "and a scar on his cheek." Gasps erupted across the room. Several jurors exchanged shocked glances, because earlier testimony had described the defendant exactly that way. The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Objection!" He barked, his voice louder than it needed to be. "This is irregular. Hearsay. The dog." The judge cut him off with a firm bang of his gavel. "Sit down, counselor. The court has ruled on this. The child may continue." The defense attorney sank back into his chair, his jaw tight, his pen tapping furiously against his notepad. For the first time, he looked rattled. The prosecutor's voice remained soft, but her pulse raced. "You're doing such a good job. Can you tell your dog what the man said to you?" The little girl's face tightened, fear flickering across her features. The retriever leaned against her again, his steady presence a reminder that she wasn't alone. She whispered slowly, haltingly, but with unmistakable clarity. She says, "The man told her not to tell anyone," the handler repeated. The room erupted again, this time with a sharp intake of collective breath. The jury members scribbled furiously, their pens scratching across notepads in unison. The prosecutor forced herself not to smile. This was no time for celebration. But inside, she felt the weight of victory inch closer. The judge leaned forward, his voice unusually gentle. "Sweetheart, you're very brave. Take your time. No one here will hurt you." The girl looked up briefly, her eyes wide and wet, then turned back to the retriever. Her voice, still only a whisper, grew steadier with each word. She says, "The man hurt her," the handler translated softly. Gasps filled the courtroom, sharper than before. The prosecutor closed her eyes for a brief moment, steadying her emotions. She had prepared for this, but hearing it spoken aloud, even through the dog, was like a knife to the chest. The defense attorney jumped up again. "Objection." Leading the witness. "Overruled," the judge snapped, his gavel slamming down. His eyes narrowed at the defense attorney, daring him to push further. The retriever shifted again, pressing his weight more firmly against the girl. She hugged him tightly, her tiny body trembling, but her voice no longer faltered. Whisper by whisper, she began to share the fragments of her story, the things she had seen, the words that had been said, the fear she had felt. Each whisper passed from her lips into the retriever's ear, and each translation from the handler became another piece of truth laid bare before the court. The jury leaned in, captivated. The gallery sat motionless, hardly daring to breathe. Even the judge, seasoned by decades of trials, could not mask the emotion on his face. For the first time, the courtroom was united not in legal argument or strategy, but in awe of a child's courage and the silent guardian who had given her the strength to speak. The prosecutor stepped back, allowing the moment to breathe. She knew the most powerful testimony wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, whispered, fragile, but undeniably true. And in that courtroom, those whispers carried more weight than any shouted declaration ever could. The little girl leaned against the retriever, her eyes closing briefly as though exhausted. But she had done it. She had found her voice, not for the adults who demanded it, but for the dog who simply listened. The prosecutor turned to the judge. No further questions at this time. The judge nodded, his voice hushed but firm. We'll recess until tomorrow morning. The gavel struck. The crowd rose. But no one forgot the sound of those whispers, carried on the back of a golden retriever's quiet strength, transforming silence into truth. The courtroom was still buzzing from the previous day when the trial resumed. People had gone home the night before and told their families about the little girl and the golden retriever, who had changed everything. By morning, the benches were more crowded than ever. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder at the back, their notebooks ready, cameras discreetly tucked under arms, waiting for the moment the child would speak again. The girl entered quietly with her mother, clutching her stuffed rabbit in one hand, the dog's leash in the other. The golden retriever walked proudly beside her, his calm presence turning heads as though he were the star witness himself. The child's steps, once timid, now carried a small trace of confidence. She wasn't walking into the unknown anymore. She was walking toward her friend. The jurors noticed. Their eyes followed the girl and the dog all the way to the witness stand. Several members smiled softly, their expressions betraying relief that the child seemed less frightened than before. The judge observed carefully, his stern features tempered with compassion. He, too, understood that the courtroom had transformed. No longer just a place of law and procedure, it had become something else, a place where innocence fought to be heard. The bailiff helped the little girl into her seat. She immediately reached down to stroke the retriever's head, her tiny fingers weaving through his golden fur. The courtroom hushed. The air felt fragile, as though the smallest misstep might break the trust that had been so carefully built. The prosecutor stepped forward, her voice soft. "Good morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep well?" The girl bent down, whispering into the dog's ear. The handler leaned in, listening closely. "She says she slept with her bunny and dreamed about the dog," he translated. A ripple of warmth moved through the room. A few jurors chuckled under their breath. Even the judge's lips twitched with the faintest smile. "Wonderful," the prosecutor continued. "Do you want to tell your dog more about what happened that day?" The little girl nodded. She leaned down again, whispering softly. The retriever sat perfectly still, patient, his ears twitching slightly, as if he alone could hear the sacred words. The handler's voice broke the silence. "She says..." She was playing outside when the man came. The jurors scribbled furiously. The defense attorney straightened in his chair, his pen tapping loudly against the table. His strategy had been unraveling since the dog's arrival, and now every whispered word deepened the cracks. "Can you tell your dog what happened when you saw him?" the prosecutor asked. The girl pressed her face into the retriever's ear, whispering longer this time. Her tiny hands gripped his fur tightly, as though anchoring herself. The handler listened and then spoke with measured calm. "She says..." A man called her name. He told her to come closer. A collective shiver ran through the gallery. Parents in the audience instinctively tightened their grip on their children. The jury leaned in further, their pens still racing across paper. The prosecutor's throat tightened, but her voice stayed gentle. "You're very brave. Can you tell your dog what you felt when he said that?" Again, the girl whispered. Her voice was clearer this time, less hesitant. "She says..." She was scared, the handler translated. She wanted to run, but her feet wouldn't move. Gasps filled the air. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably, their eyes moist. The defense attorney slammed his pen onto the table, muttering under his breath. He knew the testimony was striking deep into the hearts of everyone present. The prosecutor allowed a pause. She didn't want to overwhelm the child. She glanced at the retriever, who seemed to sense the tension. The dog nuzzled the girl gently, and she giggled softly, almost shyly. That sound, so innocent and sweet, broke the courtroom's heavy silence like sunlight piercing storm clouds. Encouraged, the prosecutor asked again, "Can you tell your dog what the man did next?" The girl bent forward, whispering into the retriever's ear. Her words were longer now, her tone steady. She no longer looked at the gallery or the jury. Her entire world was the golden retriever who listened without judgment. The handler cleared his throat. "She says?" The man grabbed her arm. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, even a few sharp cries echoed from the gallery. The judge banged his gavel. "Order, I will have order." But even his stern voice couldn't erase the impact of the child's words. The prosecutor's voice was calm, but her eyes glistened. "You're doing so well. Can you tell your dog what happened after he grabbed you?" The little girl pressed her lips to the retriever's ear. Her voice carried on a fragile thread, but it was unwavering. "She says he told her not to tell anyone, or he'd be angry." The jurors' faces hardened. Some shook their heads, disbelief and anger written across their features. The defense attorney leapt to his feet. "Objection. Hearsay. This is outrageous." The judge glared. "Overruled. Sit down, counselor." The defense attorney sank into his chair, defeated. His earlier confidence was gone, replaced with frustration he couldn't mask. The girl stroked the retriever again, her shoulders relaxing slightly. She was still whispering in fragments, still clinging to the comfort of her canine guardian, but her story was clear now. Each word added weight to the truth. Each whisper stripped away the defense's arguments. The prosecutor asked one last question. "Can you tell your dog how you felt when he said those words?" The child leaned close. She spoke longer this time, her whisper carrying conviction. The handler paused, visibly moved, before translating. "She says she was scared, but now she feels safe, because the dog is here." The gallery erupted into tears. The jurors sat frozen, their pens stilled, their hearts fully captured. Even the judge leaned back in his chair, his usually stoic expression softened by the power of innocence and the extraordinary courage it had taken to speak. The prosecutor nodded gently. No further questions. The retriever lay quietly at the girl's feet, tail thumping softly against the floor, as though he, too, understood the weight of what had just been accomplished. And in that moment, the courtroom wasn't just a place of law. It was a place where innocence had found its courage, carried not by force, but by the silent, unwavering strength of a golden retriever. The little girl had spoken, and nothing would ever be the same. By the time the court reconvened the following morning, the building no longer felt like the austere chamber of justice it had once been. Whispers filled the hallways long before the judge entered. Strangers who had never spoken to one another leaned close, trading remarks about the little girl, the retriever, and the way innocence had pierced through the heavy air of legal formality. The media presence had doubled overnight. Vans lined the courthouse steps. Reporters gathered under umbrellas, their voices echoing through microphones as they relayed the story to the nation. A child who spoke only to a dog, and in doing so, brought a courtroom to its knees. Inside, the jury filed in, their faces solemn yet softened. They had carried the weight of the child's whispers home with them, unable to leave the words behind. Some had confessed to sleepless nights, haunted by the girl's tiny voice, translated by the handler. For once, testimony was not just evidence, it was memory, emotion, something they could feel deep in their bones, that the bailiff's call for order seemed unnecessary. The room was already still, held together by a reverence no gavel could command. Then the little girl entered, hand in hand with her mother, her stuffed rabbit pressed tightly against her chest. At her side, as always, padded the golden retriever. His paws clicked softly against the polished wood floor, and heads turned as if a dignitary had arrived. But he was not met with whispers of curiosity anymore. He was met with respect. The courtroom had begun to see him as more than an animal. He was protector, interpreter, lifeline. The child climbed into her seat with quiet determination. She did not appear as timid as before. Instead, her eyes found the retriever's, and a small smile flickered across her face. She had found a rhythm, a way to exist in this world of adults without being swallowed by its intensity. The prosecutor began her questioning. "Good morning again," she said softly. "Are you ready to talk to your dog some more today?" The girl nodded, bending to whisper into the retriever's ear. The handler leaned in, then looked up. "She says she's ready." The words carried more weight than anyone expected. Ready. A simple word, but powerful. It told the jury that the child was not only speaking, but choosing to be here, choosing to face the shadows that had once silenced her. The prosecutor asked gentle, guiding questions, each one allowing the girl to share more details through her canine confidant. The whispers became longer, steadier. Descriptions emerged, the clothes the man wore, the sound of his voice, the place where it had happened. Each revelation was like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of truth across the courtroom. The defense attorney tried to object, but the sharp edge of his voice seemed out of place now. The jury no longer looked at him with interest. His arguments felt small, technical, disconnected from the raw humanity that unfolded in front of them. His frustration was obvious, his pen tapping against the desk in uneven bursts. His jaw clenched tight. At one point, during cross-examination, he attempted to rattle the child. He approached with his voice, dripping in exaggerated sweetness. "Now, little one, isn't it true that dogs don't really talk? Isn't it true that you're just pretending?" The child shrank back for the first time that morning. The retriever, sensing her discomfort, pressed his body firmly against her legs. The girl's fingers dug into his fur, her breath shallow. The prosecutor shot to her feet. Objection. Badgering the witness, the judge's gavel cracked against the wood. His eyes blazed. Sustained. "Counselor, you will adjust your tone immediately." The defense attorney opened his mouth to argue, but the judge cut him off with a voice that silenced the entire room. "This child is here under extraordinary circumstances. You will respect that, or I will hold you in contempt. Am I clear?" The attorney's shoulders sagged. "Yes, Your Honor," he muttered, retreating. The girl bent down to whisper again. The handler listened, then spoke softly. "She says the dog knows she's not pretending." The courtroom erupted in quiet laughter, not cruel or mocking, but tender, touched by the purity of her words. Even the judge allowed himself a rare smile. In that moment, the child had disarmed not only the defense attorney, but the very atmosphere of the trial. She had reminded them all that truth often comes in the simplest of forms. From then on, the testimony flowed more freely. The girl whispered steadily, telling her story piece by piece, each detail strengthening the case against the defendant. The jurors didn't just listen. They leaned into every word, their eyes soft, their pens momentarily forgotten, as they simply absorbed her courage. The transformation wasn't just in the girl. The courtroom itself seemed different, lighter, warmer, more human. People who usually kept their emotions in check, the bailiff, the clerks, even the court reporter, typing every word, found themselves blinking back tears. The walls that usually held only formality now echoed with something greater. Empathy. By afternoon, when the judge called for recess, no one rose immediately. It was as if they were reluctant to break the spell. to leave the fragile yet powerful connection that had been built between innocence and justice. The little girl slid off her chair, clutching her stuffed rabbit. The retriever rose with her, staying close, his tail swaying slowly. As she walked past the jury box, she paused. For a moment, her small eyes met those of the jurors. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. Her presence alone was a message. I have found my voice. You have heard me. Outside the courtroom, reporters rushed forward, microphones flashing, but the mother shielded her daughter. The child didn't answer questions. She didn't need to. The story was already written across the faces of everyone who had been inside. Back in the emptying courtroom, the judge sat silently for a moment before leaving the bench. He removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. He had presided over hundreds of trials, some filled with violence, deceit, and tragedy. But never had he seen a case where the voice of a child, carried through the ear of a dog, had the power to transform not only the evidence, but the very soul of the courtroom. And so the trial marched on. But it was no longer just about guilt or innocence. It was about courage. It was about the extraordinary bond between a frightened little girl and a golden retriever who gave her the strength to whisper her truth. In that courtroom, justice had found a new language. And it was spoken not in arguments or objections, but in whispers, wagging tails, and the innocence of a child's voice finally set free. The trial entered its final stretch, with tension so thick it clung to the air like fog. By now, the nation was watching. News outlets replayed sketches of the little girl, sitting beside the golden retriever with her stuffed rabbit in her lap, her lips brushing the dog's ear as she whispered truths too painful to say aloud. Commentators debated the legality of it all. Was it admissible? Was it fair? But to those inside the courtroom, the debates didn't matter. What mattered was that the child had spoken, and the jury had listened. That morning, the defense attorney walked into court with a face set like stone. His once confident stride now looked stiff, his shoulders hunched. He knew the narrative was slipping beyond his control. The jurors no longer looked at him the way they had in the first days of trial. Their eyes weren't searching his arguments for clarity. They were watching the child, listening for whispers, waiting for the next truth to fall into their laps like fragile, sacred confessions. The defendant sat at the defense table, pale and restless. His lawyer leaned close, whispering furiously, but the man's eyes kept drifting toward the girl. Each time her small frame shifted in the witness chair, his jaw clenched tighter. It was clear that whatever advantage he thought he had was evaporating. The bailiff called for order. The judge entered, robes flowing, his gavel striking once. Court is now in session. The prosecutor rose, calm but alert, and addressed the court. Your Honor, the state calls the child witness back to the stand. The little girl entered holding her mother's hand. The golden retriever padded beside her, tail swishing gently, his presence commanding respect that words could not. The jury smiled faintly, their shoulders softening as though greeting an old friend. She settled into the chair, clutching her stuffed rabbit, and immediately bent to stroke the dog's head. The transformation from frightened silence to quiet determination was remarkable. Where once she had hidden behind her mother's leg, now she leaned forward, prepared to speak not to the sea of strangers staring at her, but to the dog who had never failed to listen. The prosecutor approached slowly. Good morning, sweetheart. Yesterday, you told your dog some very brave things. Do you remember? The girl nodded. She leaned down, whispering into the retriever's ear. The handler listened, then relayed. She says yes. The prosecutor continued. Do you want to tell your dog some more today? Again, the girl whispered. The handler translated. She says she wants to finish her story. The jury leaned forward as one. The defense attorney tensed. This was the moment he had feared. Not just fragments, but a full narrative, steady and clear. The prosecutor asked, "Sweetheart, can you tell your dog what happened after the man grabbed your arm?" The girl bent low, whispering in a stream of words. Her little fingers curled into the dog's fur, as if each strand anchored her courage. The handler's voice, though calm, trembled faintly with the gravity of the message. "She says." He pulled her toward the shed. The room stiffened. Gasps broke the silence. The prosecutor's voice quivered, but she steadied herself. "And what happened inside the shed?" The girl whispered again. The handler listened intently, then spoke. "She says." He told her not to cry. He shut the door. The gallery erupted into horrified murmurs. The judge slammed his gavel. "Order. There will be order in this court." But even as the wood cracked against the bench, the jurors' faces told the story. They were shaken, horrified, moved. The defense attorney's pen slipped from his fingers. The prosecutor's eyes glistened. "You're doing so well. Can you tell your dog what happened next?" The girl's whispers grew longer, steadier. Though her voice could not be heard by the room, her conviction filled every corner of it. The handler cleared his throat, his voice taut with restraint. "She says." He hurt her. She wanted to scream, but she was too scared. A heavy silence blanketed the courtroom. Jurors sat motionless, their pens forgotten, their expressions carved with grief and anger. The prosecutor paused, letting the weight of the words linger. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "you are very brave. Can you tell your dog what you did after?" The girl leaned close again. Whisper, pause, whisper. Her eyes flickered toward the defendant, then darted back to the retriever, as if only the dog could shield her from the sight. "She says." She ran when he turned away. She ran home to her mommy. At those words, the child clutched her stuffed rabbit so tightly it seemed it might tear. The retriever leaned his head into her lap, grounding her, his eyes calm and steady. The prosecutor nodded, her voice catching. "No further questions, Your Honor." The judge turned to the defense. "Cross-examination?" The defense attorney stood, but his movements were clumsy, his words stumbling. He tried to undermine the testimony, suggesting that a dog couldn't confirm anything, that a child's memory was fragile, that whispers couldn't be trusted. But the jury didn't look at him. Their eyes were fixed on the girl, on the golden retriever's quiet presence, on the courage it had taken for her to relive her nightmare. When the attorney pressed harder, asking, "How can we even know what she really said?" The girl bent down and whispered quickly into the retriever's ear. The handler listened, then smiled faintly before translating. "She says." The dog knows. And that's enough. The jury laughed softly, not mocking, but moved. The prosecutor sat back, relief washing over her. The defense attorney froze, his face red, his strategy shattered by the simplest, most innocent declaration. The judge leaned forward, his voice deep and steady. "The witness's testimony stands. Counselor, proceed carefully." But there was nothing left to salvage. The defense attorney stammered through a few more half-hearted questions before collapsing into his seat. The defendant shifted uncomfortably, his face pale, sweat gathering on his brow. The turning point had arrived not with a shout, not with a grand speech, but with a child's whispers and a dog's patient ears. The courtroom felt it. The jury felt it. Even the judge, who had spent decades cloaked in impartiality, seemed to feel it. The little girl slid from her chair, hugging her stuffed rabbit tightly. She reached down to wrap her arms around the retriever's neck, pressing her cheek into his fur. For the first time, she smiled a real smile. Bright and pure, Dot. The jury watched that moment with rapt attention, and though none of them spoke, the thought echoed silently among them all. The truth has been spoken. Justice is within reach, and as the gavel struck to adjourn for the day, the defense knew it too. The tide had turned, and there was no turning back. The courthouse buzzed with attention that felt alive on the morning of the verdict. Crowds pressed against the steps outside, reporters jostling for space as cameras clicked endlessly. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation. Jurors filed into their seats with unreadable expressions, their duty etched across their faces. For weeks, they had been listening, weighing, and carrying the fragile voice of a child whispered into a golden retriever's ear. The little girl arrived quietly with her mother, her stuffed rabbit clutched close. At her side, as always, padded the golden retriever, tail swishing slowly as though he sensed the gravity of the day. The gallery stirred, heads turning to watch the pair. The girl's steps were small but steady. Though she had spoken only in whispers, she had become the loudest voice in the courtroom. The defendant sat rigid at the defense table, his eyes darting nervously toward the jury box. His once arrogant smirk had disappeared, replaced by an unease he couldn't disguise. His lawyer shuffled papers with frantic precision, though he knew the case had slipped beyond his grasp. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. His gavel struck once, sharp and final. Court is now in session. The clerk rose. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict? The forewoman stood, her hands trembling slightly as she held the folded slip of paper. The room leaned forward, hearts pounding. Even the golden retriever raised his head, ears twitching as though he, too, awaited the words. Yes, we have, Your Honor. The bailiff carried the note to the judge, who read it silently before returning it. His face remained stoic, but there was a glimmer in his eyes as he handed it back. Please read the verdict aloud. The forewoman cleared her throat, her voice strong despite the weight of the moment. On the charge of aggravated assault and endangerment, we find the defendant guilty. The gallery erupted gasps, sobs, muffled cheers. The defendant slumped back in his chair, his face drained of all color. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm, but the gesture was hollow, meaningless. The man who had once controlled the shadows of fear had been exposed by the smallest, bravest voice in the room. The judge's gavel slammed. Order, order in this court. The room settled, though the undercurrent of relief and triumph remained. The little girl did not fully understand the words guilty or verdict, but she felt the change in the air. She sensed the release of tension, the way the juror's eyes softened, the way her mother's arms wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Most of all, she felt it in the retriever's calm gaze, as if he understood that his job was done. The prosecutor rose, her voice thick with emotion. Your Honor, the state thanks this jury for their service. Today, justice has been served, not through power or intimidation, but through courage. She glanced at the child, her eyes shining. Courage so pure that it reminded us all of what justice truly means. The judge looked down at the little girl, his stern features gentled. Young lady, he said softly, his voice carrying across the hushed courtroom, you have done something remarkable. You have reminded us that truth can come in whispers, that justice can be found in the most unexpected of places. You are very brave, and this court thanks you. The gallery erupted in quiet applause, unprompted and uncontainable. The gavel banged once more, but the judge did not silence them this time. He allowed it just this once. The defense attorney gathered his papers in silence, his shoulders hunched in defeat. The defendant was led away in handcuffs, his head bowed. The jury remained still, their eyes following the little girl, not the man in chains. For them, the true story was not about guilt. It was about innocence finding its voice. As the courtroom emptied, reporters surged forward, microphones flashing, voices calling out questions. But the mother shielded her daughter, shaking her head. No questions, she said firmly. She's just a little girl. The retriever walked beside them, calm and dignified, as though escorting royalty through a crowd. Cameras flashed, capturing the child's hand gripping his leash, the stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest, and the faint smile tugging at her lips. Outside, the courthouse steps were flooded with people. Strangers applauded as the girl emerged, their faces lit with admiration. She didn't know why they were clapping. She only knew that the dog was there, steady and warm at her side, and that the weight on her small shoulders had been lifted. That evening, news outlets across the country carried the story. Headlines blazed. Child speaks through police, dog justice delivered. Analysts debated its significance. Could this change the way vulnerable witnesses were treated in court? Could therapy dogs become more than companions? Could they be bridges to truth? But beyond the debates and headlines, the story lived where it mattered most, in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. Jurors admitted privately that they had never been so moved. Reporters confessed to tears behind their notepads. Even the judge, seasoned by decades on the bench, told his clerk quietly, "This was the trial that changed me." And for the little girl? She went home that night and fell asleep curled against her stuffed rabbit, the retriever lying at the foot of her bed. She no longer dreamed of shadows or fear. She dreamed of a courtroom filled with kind eyes, of whispers that carried weight, of a dog who listened when no one else could. In the end, justice had not come through thunderous declarations or clever arguments. It had come through innocence, through a child's courage, through the unwavering presence of a golden retriever who had turned whispers into a verdict beyond imagination. And in that truth, the courtroom, the jury, and even the world outside its walls discovered something unforgettable. Sometimes the bravest voices are the quietest, and sometimes justice comes not in the roar of authority, but in the whisper of a child.